A Chinese widow was raising twins in an old tent until a cowboy said, "You'll sleep under a roof tonight." The wind was a predator, a thing with teeth and claws that tore at the thin canvas of the tent. It howled a lament for the dying world outside, a world bleached bone-white by snow and frozen to its core. Inside, Mai huddled with her twin daughters, Lin and An, the three of them a single knot of trembling flesh beneath a threadbare grey blanket. The cold was not just in the air, it was a physical weight pressing down on them, a thief stealing the warmth from their blood and the hope from her heart. Her dress, a traditional cheongsam of pale pink silk, was a ghost of a former life, its delicate fabric now frayed and stained, a cruel mockery of the elegance it once represented. It offered no defense against the brutal Wyoming winter. Her daughters, both 7 years old, wore plain, rough-spun dresses the color of dried mud, their small bodies tucked tight against hers. They did not cry. They had learned long ago that tears froze on the cheeks and stole what little heat remained. Instead, they were silent, their wide, dark eyes fixed on their mother's face, trusting her to solve a problem that had no solution. They were starving. The last of the dried jerky was gone 2 days ago, and the fire had died that morning, the final piece of scavenged wood turning to a whisper of grey ash. Mai's world had shrunk to this single, desperate purpose, to keep the shivers from consuming her children. She sang to them, a quiet, humming lullaby from a land they would never know, her voice a thin thread against the gale. Wei, her husband, was gone. Lost to this same unforgiving land, to the greed of men who saw his gentle spirit as weakness. He had promised her a new life, a place of safety. Now all that was left of his promise was this failing tent and the crushing weight of his absence. The wind clawed at the canvas again, a sound like rending cloth, and a fine dusting of snow sifted through a new tear, landing on the blanket like a death shroud. A tremor of utter despair ran through Mai. She had failed them. She had failed him. Then, through the roar of the storm, came a different sound. A rhythmic, muffled thudding. It was heavy, and it was getting closer. Her heart seized, a cold fist of terror clutching it tight. In this wilderness, a stranger was rarely a savior. She clutched her daughters tighter, her body a fragile shield, and waited for the end to arrive. The sound resolved itself into the unmistakable beat of horses' hooves, slow and deliberate in the deep snow. A shadow fell over the tent, a vast shape that blocked the already dim, grey light of the afternoon. Mai held her breath, every muscle in her body tensed. Lin and An burrowed their faces into her side, their small hands gripping the thin fabric of her cheongsam. The hoofbit stopped. There was a soft creak of leather, a heavy sigh that was not the wind's, and then the crunch of boots in the snow just outside the tent flap. Mai's mind raced through a litany of horrors. Bandits, prospectors driven mad by solitude, or worse, the men who had taken her husband. She had nothing left to give, nothing but her life and the lives of her children, and she would fight for them with the ferocity of a cornered animal. The canvas flap was pushed aside. A man stood there, framed against the swirling snow, so large he seemed to fill the entire world. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, his face half hidden by a low-brimmed hat and a thick, dark beard dusted with ice. A heavy coat made of animal hide hung from his frame, and his eyes, when they met hers, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm. They were not cruel eyes, but they were weary, filled with a profound and ancient sadness. He took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance, the tattered tent, the dead fire, the woman in her ridiculously inadequate dress, and the two small, terrified faces peering out from the blanket. He did not speak for a long moment, his gaze lingering on the children. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his expression, a ghost of a pain she could not name. Mai stared back, her defiance a brittle shield. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together, yet strangely gentle. He said, the word simple, respectful. He gestured with a gloved hand back the way he had come. There's a storm coming. A bad one. You can't stay here. Mai said nothing, her throat too tight with fear to form words. He waited, his patience a palpable thing in the frozen air. He looked at the children again, and his voice softened further. They can't stay here. He took a half step back, giving them space, his movement slow and non-threatening. His black horse stood behind him, a magnificent, powerful creature whose warm breath plumed in the frigid air. The man looked directly at his gaze steady and clear. He made a promise that cut through the howling wind and her own despair. "You'll sleep under a roof tonight." The journey was a waking nightmare rendered in shades of white and grey. The man, who had given his name as Thomas, lifted Lynn and Anne onto the saddle of his great black horse, wrapping them in a thick wool blanket he produced from his saddle roll. He walked beside the animal, one hand steady on the reins, the other occasionally resting on the children's legs to ensure they were secure. Mai followed in the horse's wake, her thin slippers sinking deep into the snow with every agonizing step. The cold was a physical pain, 1,000 needles piercing her skin, and her legs felt like brittle glass, ready to shatter. Yet she pushed on, her eyes fixed on the backs of her daughters, on the solid, reassuring presence of the man leading them. He did not rush her. He seemed to sense the very limit of her endurance, pausing when her steps faltered, his expression unreadable but his actions speaking a language of quiet consideration. After what felt like an eternity, a shape began to emerge from the swirling snow, the dark, angular silhouette of a cabin. It was small and rough-hewn, nestled in a grove of pines that offered some protection from the wind. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile ribbon of grey against the white sky, promising a warmth Mai could scarcely imagine. Inside, the cabin was a single room, rustic and Spartan, but it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. A fire blazed in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering orange glow over the wooden walls and the simple, sturdy furniture. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and something else, something savory. Thomas settled the girls on a bearskin rug near the fire, then ladled a thick, steaming stew into 3 wooden bowls. He handed one to Mai, his calloused fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. "It's not much," he said, his voice still that low rumble. "Just rabbit." Mai took the bowl, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold it. It was more than much. It was life. She watched as her daughters ate, their fear slowly melting away in the face of such elemental comforts, warmth and food. They ate with a desperate hunger that broke her heart, but Thomas seemed not to notice, or at least, he had the grace to pretend he didn't. He moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency, tending the fire, checking the shutters, his presence a solid, grounding force. Mai remained wary, a tightly coiled spring of suspicion, but as she watched him, she saw not a predator but a man deeply at home in his solitude, a man whose kindness seemed to cost him something. The storm descended with the fury of a vengeful god, trapping them within the 4 walls of the cabin. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the single, shuttered window. A strange, quiet rhythm established itself. Thomas was a man of few words, his silence as vast and profound as the wilderness outside. He spent his time mending tack, sharpening an axe, or simply staring into the fire, his thoughts a locked room to which Mai had no key. He never pressed her for her story, never asked where she had come from or where she was going. He simply provided. He gave them food, he kept the fire roaring, and he offered them a corner of his solitary world without question or condition. This silent acceptance was more disarming than any interrogation could have been. The children, with their innate ability to sense the truth of a person's heart, were the first to thaw. They would watch him, their dark eyes following his large, gentle hands as he worked. One afternoon, Anne, the bolder of the two, approached him as he sat by the fire. She held out the remains of a small, cloth doll, its arm torn nearly off. She said nothing, simply looked from the doll to his face with an expression of solemn hope. Thomas looked at the offered toy, then at the little girl. A flicker of warmth entered his tired eyes. He took the doll carefully, as if it were a precious, fragile thing. "Let's see here," he murmured, his voice softer than Mai had ever heard it. He produced a needle and thread from a small leather pouch and, with surprising dexterity, began to stitch the doll's arm back into place. Lynn crept closer to watch, and soon both girls were sitting at his feet, captivated. Mai watched from across the room, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and fear. That night, when the children were asleep in a makeshift bed near the hearth, she finally spoke. "They killed my husband," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones. Thomas stopped stirring the embers and looked at her, his expression giving nothing away. His name was Way. He was a surveyor. He found something. A piece of land. A man named Bartholomew Kane wanted it. She touched the collar of her cheongsam, where, stitched into the lining, was Way's last legacy. He left me a map. I do not know what it leads to. Only that Mr. Kane's men killed him for it. Thomas's jaw tightened, and a dangerous light kindled in his eyes. Kane, he said, the name a curse. I know the name. The fragile piece was shattered a week later. The storm had broken, leaving the world pristine and silent under a blanket of fresh snow and a painfully bright sun. Thomas was outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of his axe a comforting sound, when the barking started. Not the playful yapping of a stray coyote, but the deep, aggressive baying of hunting dogs. Thomas froze, axe held aloft. His head snapped up, his eyes scanning the tree line. "My," he called, his voice sharp with an urgency that sent a blade of ice through her veins. "Get the children. Get inside." Bar the door. She didn't hesitate. She swept Lynn and into the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs, and slid the heavy wooden bar across the door. Peeking through a crack in the shutters, she saw them. 3 riders emerging from the woods, their horses kicking up plumes of snow. The man in the lead was lean and wiry, with a face like a raptor and eyes that were cold and empty. This was Marcus Flint, a name she had heard whispered in fear. She recognized the cruel set of his mouth from the day Way had not come home. Thomas stood his ground in front of the cabin, the axe held loosely in one hand, his stance deceptively relaxed. Flint reined in his horse a few feet away. "Well, look what we have here," Flint said, his voice a mocking drawl. "The hermit. Heard you were still hiding out here. Kane wants what you're protecting." He nodded toward the cabin. "The woman and the map." Thomas's voice was dangerously low. "There's no woman here. You're on my land." "Leave," Flint chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Your land? Nothing in this valley is yours, old man. It all belongs to Mr. Kane." He swung down from his horse, his men fanning out behind him. "Give us the map, and we'll leave a cabin standing. Refuse, and we'll burn it to the ground with you and them inside it." A promise hung in the air, thick with malice. "I will not," Thomas stated, his voice flat and final. The world seemed to explode. Flint drew his pistol, but Thomas was faster, lunging forward, the axe swinging in a deadly arc. A shot rang out, splintering the cabin door. One of the other men tossed a lit torch onto the cabin's dry roof. Flames erupted with a hungry roar, and black smoke began to pour through the chinks in the walls. The sanctuary was burning. Panic seized my, cold and absolute. The cabin filled with thick, acrid smoke, stealing the air from her lungs. The children were coughing, their small faces streaked with soot and terror. The roar of the fire outside was a living beast, consuming their small haven. Through the choking haze, Thomas appeared, shoving his way back inside. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his face a grim mask of fury and determination. "This way," he yelled over the crackling inferno, grabbing a corner of the heavy bearskin rug near the hearth. "Quickly!" He threw the rug aside, revealing a dark, square shape in the floorboards, a hidden trapdoor. With a grunt of effort, he wrenched it open, exposing a black opening and a small ladder leading down into the darkness. "It's a root cellar," he explained, his voice strained. "Go. There's a tunnel at the back. It leads out to the creek bed." He shoved my towards the opening, his urgency overriding her fear. She scrambled down the ladder into the cold, damp earth, the smell of soil a welcome relief from the smoke. She turned and held her arms up for her daughters. Thomas passed them down, one by one, their small bodies trembling uncontrollably. "Keep moving," he commanded, his silhouette framed against the raging fire above. "I will be right behind you." He slammed the heavy door shut, plunging them into near-total darkness, and the roar of the fire was suddenly muffled. Mai fumbled for her children's hands, pulling them deeper into the cellar. Her hands brushed against the cold, earthen wall until she found the opening Thomas had described. It was a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel, just wide enough for them to crawl through. They moved through the suffocating blackness, the sounds of the battle and the fire above them faint and terrifying. Finally, she saw a sliver of grey light ahead. They burst out of the tunnel into the blinding white snow of the creek bed, gasping the clean, frigid air. A moment later, Thomas emerged behind them, covered in soot and grime, his chest heaving. He led them into the cover of the dense pines, and together they watched as the roof of the cabin collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the winter sky. Their sanctuary was gone, a funeral pyre in the snow. They were back where they had started, in the heart of the wilderness, but this time, they were not alone. He was with them, wounded but unbroken. They huddled in the deep woods, the silence broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the ragged sound of their own breathing. The cold, banished for a precious week, returned with a vengeance, seeping into their bones. Thomas tore a strip of cloth from his shirt and pressed it against the wound on his head, his movement steady despite the tremor of rage that ran through him. His gaze was fixed on the smoldering ruins of his home, but his eye saw something else, a memory of a different fire, a different loss. When he finally turned to me, the sadness in his eyes was so profound it was like looking into a deep, dark well. "He will not stop," Thomas said, his voice raspy. "Cain will not stop until he has that map." I clutched her daughters close, their warmth a small anchor in a sea of fear. "What can we do? Where can we go?" He scanned the surrounding wilderness, his gaze sharp and calculating. He was a part of this landscape, and its secrets were his. "There's a place," he said after a long moment. "An old line shack, north of here. Over the ridge. It's not much, but it will offer shelter. We can rest there, and I can think the journey was even more brutal than the first." The ridge was steep and treacherous, the wind a physical blow that threatened to tear them from the mountainside. Thomas carried one of the girls, and Mike carried the other, their combined strength barely enough to make the ascent. Hours later, exhausted and half frozen, they found it, a tiny, dilapidated shack leaning against a rock face, almost completely buried in snow. It was little more than a crude box of rotting timbers, but it was a shield against the wind. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp earth and decay. Thomas used his flint and steel to start a small, smoky fire in the crude hearth. "You will stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked at Mai, his eyes boring into hers. "Bar the door after I leave. Do not open it for anyone but me." "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "To hunt," he said. But she knew he was not hunting for food. He was hunting men. He checked his pistol, his movements precise and economical. He took a long, lingering look at Lin Anan, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep by the small fire. Then, without another word, he slipped out into the gathering dusk, a vengeful ghost moving through the frozen forest, his purpose as cold and hard as the winter ground. He would not let the past repeat itself. He would not lose another family to the fire and greed of men like Cain. Thomas moved through the twilight forest with a lethal grace, a predator in his own domain. He was not the gentle recluse from the cabin now, he was a man honed by grief and fury, every sense alive to the subtlest sign. He found their tracks easily. Flint was arrogant, his men careless. They believed him to be trapped, a victim cowering in the snow. They did not know the man they had provoked. He followed them to a narrow, rocky canyon, a natural choke point he knew well. They had made camp, a bright, noisy fire betraying their position. They were drinking, laughing about the cabin, their voices echoing off the cold stone. Marcus Flint stood apart from them, staring into the flames, his cruel face illuminated by the light. Thomas circled around them, using the terrain for cover, a shadow among shadows. He moved with the patience of a mountain cat, waiting for the perfect moment. He started with the man posted as a lookout, a silent takedown from behind that left the man unconscious in a snowdrift. One by one, he isolated the others, using the darkness and the confusing echoes of the canyon to his advantage. It was not a gunfight, it was a systematic dismantling of his enemy. A thrown rock to distract, a swift, brutal blow to incapacitate. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, his actions driven by a cold, clear purpose. Soon, only Flint remained. He finally sensed something was wrong, the silence of his men suddenly unnerving. He drew his pistol, peering into the oppressive darkness beyond the fire. "Show yourself," he snarled. Thomas stepped into the firelight, his face a mask of grim resolve. "You burned down my home," he said, his voice a low growl. Flint's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in contempt. He raised his pistol, but Thomas was already moving, lunging forward, not with the wild swing of an axe, but with the focused power of a brawler. He knocked the gun from Flint's hand, and the two men crashed to the ground. The fight was savage and primal. Flint was wiry and quick, fighting with a dirty, desperate viciousness. But Thomas fought with the weight of his entire past, with the ghosts of a wife and son he had failed to protect. He absorbed Flint's blows, his resolve hardening with each impact, until he finally overpowered the smaller man. He pinned Flint to the frozen ground, his hands around the enforcer's throat. For a moment, he saw the face of another man, another time. The temptation to end it was overwhelming. But then he saw the faces of Linen and the desperate hope in Mai's eyes. He would not become the monster he was fighting. He released his grip, leaving Flint gasping for air. He would not grant him a quick death in the wilderness. He would drag him back to the town, back to the flimsy justice of men, and let the law handle the rest. Thomas returned to the line shack just before dawn, a weary, battered spectre emerging from the pre-dawn gloom. He was not empty-handed. He had Flint and his two conscious men bound and tethered, their spirits broken. He secured them outside, far enough from the shack that they posed no threat, before finally entering the small shelter. Mai was awake, sitting by the fire, a piece of firewood held like a club. The relief that washed over her face when she saw him was so profound it was almost painful to witness. He collapsed by the hearth, the adrenaline that had sustained him finally draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the wind. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the gloom, Mai reached into the collar of her cheongsam and carefully removed the oilskin packet containing her husband's map. She unfolded it on the floor, the delicate paper worn and creased. In the weak light of the cabin, it looked the same as it always had, a confusing series of lines and strange symbols. But then, a beam of sunlight struck the paper at an angle, illuminating faint indentation she had never noticed before. It was writing, pressed into the paper so as not to be seen. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. He leaned closer, his eyes tracing the faint script. It was not a map to a gold mine or a hidden treasure. It was a legal survey, meticulously detailed, with coordinates, boundary markers, and geological notes. Wei's careful handwriting described a hidden valley, blessed with a deep, fertile topsoil, a natural spring, and protection from the worst of the winter winds. At the bottom, pressed so faintly it was almost invisible, was a legal filing number from the Territorial Land Office. "It's not a map," Thomas breathed, a slow smile spreading across his weary face. "It's a deed." He registered it. He bought the land legally before Kane could grab it. All this time, the weapon they needed was not a gun or a knife, but a simple piece of paper. It was Wei's final gift, his quiet intelligence, his ultimate shield. They journeyed to the town of Redemption, a muddy, sprawling settlement. They did not go to Kane's opulent ranch house. They went straight to the marshal's office, with Flint and his men in tow. They presented the deed and gave their testimony. The meticulously documented survey, filed and stamped by the authorities, was irrefutable. Bartholomew Kane, for all his wealth and power, had been outmaneuvered by a quiet surveyor and his unbreakable promise. His empire, built on intimidation and theft, began to crumble under the simple weight of the law. Spring arrived as a promise fulfilled. The snow receded, revealing the rich, dark earth of the valley Wei had found for them. It was exactly as his survey had described, a perfect sanctuary, nestled in the arms of the mountains, green and teeming with life. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and damp soil. A small, sturdy house was taking shape near the gurgling spring, built from the timber of the surrounding forest. The rhythmic sound of a hammer striking nails echoed in the peaceful valley, a sound of creation, not destruction. Mai worked alongside Thomas, her hands, once soft and delicate, now strong and capable. The tattered pink cheongsam was gone, replaced by a practical dress of sturdy blue cotton. A quiet strength radiated from her, the resilience of a flower that had bloomed in the harshest of winters. Lin and An were no longer the silent, haunted children from the tent. They ran through the meadows of wildflowers, their laughter a bright, joyful sound that the valley seemed to welcome. They brought Thomas offerings of colorful stones and chased butterflies, their faces bright with the simple, unburdened happiness of childhood. They were healing. They were all healing. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they no longer held dominion. The memory of Wei was not a source of pain, but one of gratitude for the legacy he had left them. The trauma of the fire was fading, replaced by the warmth of the spring sun and the security of the solid walls they were building together. Thomas was a changed man. The profound sadness in his eyes had not vanished entirely, but it was now tempered by a quiet contentment. He had found a purpose beyond mere survival, a reason to rebuild not just a house, but a life. The unspoken affection between him and Mai had blossomed into a gentle, powerful bond, a love forged in fire and ice, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared survival. One evening, they stood together, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The children were asleep inside, safe under the new roof. Mai leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, a simple gesture of trust and belonging. They had found their home. They had become a family. The wilderness had tried to break them, but instead, it had brought them together, their broken pieces fitting together to create something new, something whole and beautiful. Their story is a testament, is it not? A testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit when faced with the deepest despair. It speaks to the fierce, unyielding power of a mother's love and the quiet courage of a man who chose to step out of the shadows of his own grief to light the way for others. Mai, Lin, and An began their journey with nothing but a failing tent and the fading embers of hope, lost in a world that seemed designed to crush them. Yet, they endured. They faced down the howling winds of winter and the far more dangerous storms of human greed. Their survival was not a matter of luck, but a product of unshakable will and the profound impact of a single act of kindness from a stranger. Thomas, a man locked away in his own prison of past trauma, found his redemption not in vengeance, but in protection. By offering sanctuary to a desperate family, he rebuilt the parts of himself he thought were lost forever, discovering that the surest way to heal one's own heart is to offer shelter to another's. This narrative reminds us that even in the most brutal and unforgiving of landscapes, the seeds of hope can take root. It shows that true wealth is not found in land or gold, but in the bonds we forge and the safety we create for one another. Family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build in the face of adversity. If their journey from the brink of despair to a life of hope touched your heart, we invite you to become a part of our community. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a story of courage, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of survival and redemption. Your support helps us bring these stories to light. Thank you for watching.